Romans 8, verse 28 says that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. And over the last couple of weeks, as we've looked at Esther, we've begun by thinking, really? Is that our experience? Sometimes I think we think it works out in the big things of life. In all things, God works for the good. Yes, the big things, the moving of nations, the way that he preserved his people and brought Jesus as our King and our Messiah, or the big things of our life, but the minutiae, the tiny little details. Is God really working in all things? Like that time I missed the bus, like that time the car broke down, like the time the roof caved in and all of our upstairs bedrooms were covered in the rain, or whatever it is God really at work in all things? Let's briefly recap where we've got to so far. In Esther chapter 1, we were introduced to King Xerxes, and we were kind of given almost a caricature of him in his grandeur, the fact that he just wanted people to see how good he was or how great he was, and yet he was beholden to the views of his advisors. He couldn't even get his wife to come in when he wanted her to. He banished his wife on a whim and then regretted it later. But also the great evil that was behind this regime. He had the power to coerce young girls from all over his empire to come in to his harem. And one of those girls is Esther. Esther, who ends up being the one who pleases the king and is elevated to the position of queen. But last week we heard from Tim, who was our visiting speaker last week, of the plans of Haman, the Agagite. Agagite was the kind of house that he was from, an ancestor called Agag, who was an Amalekite. The Amalekites being one of the kind of the bogeymen of the Old Testament. They just keep on coming up and trying to destroy God's people. They first appear in Genesis, then again in Exodus, then again in 1 Samuel, constantly trying to get rid of God's people. And here's Haman, and he takes an opportunity, an edict, to have all the Jews in the Persian Empire destroyed. And that was all the Jews. They were all in the Persian Empire. And Esther is encouraged by her cousin, go to the king, say something, do something. And the last few words of last week's passage. When this is done, says Esther, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So, chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther, let's just pause there. On the third day, that is a common phrase throughout the Bible. Lots of things happen on the third day. The most famous, Jesus' resurrection. On the third day, we're thinking, ooh, something's about to happen. Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, let's just pause there. When he saw her, he could have done one of two things. He could have said, come here, Esther. Or if he was displeased with her, if he didn't want to be interrupted, we have inscriptions from that era of history with the king with an axeman stood next to him there to chop off the head of anyone who dared come to the king unannounced. That is what Esther was afraid of. No one can enter the king's presence without his permission. So what might happen to her? But there's more than that. What happened to the last queen who didn't do what the king wanted. We've already heard about her, Vashti, who ended up being banished. Xerxes has form here. But what happens to Esther? Well, then there's the final thing. In going to the king, Esther has been keeping her identity a secret up until now. She was a Jew, but she had been encouraged not to tell people that she was a Jew. In going to the king, she's potentially going to be revealing who she is, and she doesn't know how the king is going to take it. The king, remember, at the instigation of Haman, but the king has just signed an edict to have all of the Jews wiped out. How is he going to view seeing that his queen is one of them? All of these things must have been going through Esther's mind as she approaches the king. But then, verse 2, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Now, just a brief aside. How different is it for us approaching our king? Here, Esther, who is married to the king, is approaching with trepidation and fear. We, who are sinful, approaching the king of the universe. In one sense, how much more should we be afraid? And yet, isn't it such amazing news that the Lord says, let us approach the throne of grace with confidence to find grace and mercy in our time of need. Coming as those who have been bought by Jesus, we can approach the throne with no fear. What a contrast between our king and Xerxes. But let's carry on with the story. The king asks Esther, verse 3, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you. And we're thinking, yes, he's going to do something. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, yes, come on, Esther, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Has she bottled it? No. What she's got the king to do there is to say in public that he is going to do exactly what she asks. The king says, bring Haman at once so that we may do what Esther asks. She's going to tell him. She's going to ask him something at this banquet. But before that, she's got the king to say, yep, I'm going to do it. She's canny. She doesn't want the king to have a way of backing down. She's already got him to say he'll do something. And we're thinking, yes, great. She's got that chance. But so the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now tell me, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. And we're thinking again, come on, Esther, say it. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Yet again, we're left thinking, what are you doing, Esther? But again, in public, different group of people probably, different group of servants, maybe some nobles, don't know exactly. But yet again, the king has said in public, I'm going to do it, Esther. The stakes for the king, if he then turns back on it, are getting high. Esther is canny. Except maybe she's being too clever. Because she may have got the king to agree to stuff, but is it going to be too late for Mordecai? Haman went out that day, verse 9, happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Then he calls all of his friends together, his friends and his wife, and says, I am so wealthy. Just look at me. I am brilliant. That's my paraphrase of verse 11. And that's not all, says Haman. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. Just look at me, he said. Look at me. I'm in it. I am the man. I am so great. And I can't enjoy any of it because Mordecai the Jew refuses to bow to me. What cheek. So his wife and all his friends say, oh, set up a gallows. Set up a pole. If you're in with the king like you say you are, you'll just have to ask. He'll have him hanged. That's fine. Don't worry about it. This suggestion delighted Haman. And we're left thinking, is it going to be too late for Mordecai? What's going to happen? Chapter 6. That night, the king could not sleep. It just so happened that the king could not sleep. You can imagine the narrator saying it with a glint in his eye. It just so happened. It just so happened that Joseph was put in prison with Pharaoh's wine steward, and so ended up answering Pharaoh's request about a dream and ended up the prime minister of Egypt. It just so happened that Ruth ended up in Boaz's field and so ended up getting married and having a child that would then give birth one day, going down the years, to the Messiah. It just so happened that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in answer to ancient prophecies. It just so happened that Xerxes decided to put himself to sleep by reading the most boring book that we might think of, the book of the Chronicles of his reign, and it just so happened that the page he turned to was the bit from a number of years ago now, about 7 years previous, when Mordecai had saved his life. And the king, in the middle of the night, rather than falling asleep to the dull monotony of the list of events of his reign, goes, hang on, what's been done about this? I can't let it get out that I haven't rewarded someone for saving my life. I mean, maybe people won't want to save my life anymore if I don't give them anything. What's been done? Well, as always, this enlightened despot can't decide anything without taking advice. So the king asks, verse 4, who is in the court? Need to ask someone for his advice, and it just so happened that Haman has just arrived to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. His attendants, verse 5, answered, Haman's standing in the court. Bring him in, king ordered. And Haman, remember, Haman's just been showing off to his family and friends, saying, look at me. I'm the one who Queen Esther invited in. Aren't I the man? Doesn't the king love me? He's going to do exactly what I ask of him. And so Haman comes in with full of himself. And the king asks, verse 6, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? And now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Of course he thinks that. So he's probably been imagining these things for years, because he wants them himself. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, let them bring a royal robe. Yep, I've been eyeing them up, Xerxes. They look pretty good. One that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for Haman. I mean, the man the king delights to honor. You can almost see him picturing himself in his mind's eye. Won't that be amazing? Now is my chance. And the king says, go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew. This is where the tables start to turn. Up until now, things have been getting worse for God's people. But now, with a delicious irony, we see how God is going to turn the tables. Haman, planning Mordecai's downfall and his own glory. Now, the rest of chapter 6, parading and glorifying Mordecai and fearing his own downfall. He goes home chastened. But if he was hoping for encouragement from his family and friends, verse 13, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Could have told him earlier. But perhaps what they're starting to see, just as we are starting to see, is that God is in control, not just in control, working all things, even a sleepless night, even the flick of a page, to save his people, to, as David put it, to keep his promise, his covenant, to preserve his people. So he hurries off to the banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther's been canny, getting the king to confess in public that he's going to do what she says, and now is her chance. But she goes even further. She makes it personal. She herself is being attacked, she says. "If it pleases you, your majesty, grant me my life and spare my people, for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, annihilated. If we'd merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet." Xerxes is enraged. Who would dare threaten the queen? He is asking. Where is he, the man who would dare to do such a thing? He has already said he will do whatever Esther requests. Now he sees how personal her request is. He is going to do something. Esther says, an adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified. And you can imagine, everything has started to go wrong for him, and it's got that sense of divine inevitability. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, went out into the garden, but Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, he knows that the writing is on the wall for him, so he goes to beg Queen Esther for his life, and whether he's kind of prostrating himself because he thinks that'll help, or whether he stumbles on the carpet. I mean, this is Persia. He's there in a compromised position when the king comes back in. The king exclaims, will he even molest the queen while she's here in the palace? The king's ready to give the worst possible interpretation of the actions, and of course, we see how it ends. The pole, the gallows set up for Mordecai, now sees the end of Haman. This is poetic justice. We're in need of a miracle. And as we said at the start, often we think of miracles as the big things. But here everything turns on that sleepless night. And we ask, is it a coincidence? Well, no. The hand of God is at work. All things work for good, says Romans 8:28. And it is easier sometimes to say that about the big things, but so often his plan moves forward in these little day-to-day things. You didn't get the job. The operation put you out of action for months. You decided to walk because you'd missed the bus. You had to cancel a long-planned holiday. God works through all things, not always obviously, but In fact, sometimes we don't even see what he is doing. Sometimes we'll see decades later. Sometimes we'll never see. But the writer here wants us to see God's sovereign hand at work in everything, not just the rise and the fall of empires, but when we rise from our beds. Because God has that kind of power. Here's how the Catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism puts it. God's providence, his working through all things for our good, is his almighty and ever-present power, whereby, as with his hand, he still upholds heaven and earth and all creatures, and so governs them that, leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and barren years, food and drink, health and sickness, riches and poverty, indeed, all things come to us not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. We said a couple of weeks ago that our problem is we're in the middle of the story. We don't know how it ends. We're in the middle of our story. We don't know how it ends. But here we see Esther's story, and we're given this glimpse behind the scenes. And he's showing us that God, the way that God is writing this story, working out his great plan of salvation for the whole world, and he's writing it down to the littlest of details. Notice one thing from the Heidelberg Catechism, his fatherly hand. Who is in control? It's our Father. What is he doing in Esther? Well, he is preserving his people that the Messiah might come, the one who would bless all the nations, the Lord Jesus. So what does that mean for our lives? It's not that he will preserve us from all harm like he did for Mordecai. It's not that we will see those who oppose us defeated like Haman. But rather it is that he has worked all things to bring about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus so that we might ultimately be safe whatever happens in our story now. Whatever comes, it is his story, our Father, who is unfolding his story through our stories. A number of years ago, I saw a YouTube video for the first time of a pastor, I think in Hawaii, and some words from his sermon were kind of set to one of those videos where you've got the text kind of moving around the screen in impressive ways, just illustrating the sermon. But he was speaking on Matthew chapter 10 and verse 29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. Here's what that pastor said. He said, Jesus doesn't say that a sparrow will never fall. He says that sparrows will fall. That is, our lives are not free of trouble. Maybe you're here and actually even this week something horrible has happened to you. Something's shaken you. And you're asking, where is God? As this preacher put it, bad things happen even to innocent little birds like sparrows. Tragic, unfair, seemingly senseless things happen in this world and in our lives. But Jesus is saying these things do not happen outside of our Father's care. We cannot see the end. We can't see what he's doing, but we can trust our Father to see us through because of the example of things like the story of Esther. He's for you, and he has got you. Now imagine that we could speak to Esther earlier on in this story. Imagine you could encourage her at the start of chapter 5 as she faces the potential of being killed. What would we say? Esther, God is in control. He is your Father. He is in control. So do something. You can do it. He's got this. But imagine her response. Well, if he's in control, then why do I need to do anything? Actually, Mordecai says something like that in chapter 4. Deliverance is going to come from another place if you don't do it. God's going to do it. He's in control. Esther could think, oh, well, I don't need to do anything then. But God being in control doesn't remove our need to act, to do something. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, I was saying we all want to be in control of our lives, but are we really? Richard Dawkins, I quoted him saying, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. In a world without God, actually we're just controlled by our genes, controlled by our situation, controlled by things outside ourselves. We're just following the music of our DNA. But if there is a God, actually there being a God gives our decisions meaning, our real decisions that God then works through. The fact that God is in control doesn't mean we just sit back and do nothing. No, we're called to make decisions, to live our lives. But how can we then be responsible for our lives, our actions, if God controls them? We may not be dancing to the music of our DNA, but we're dancing to his tune, surely. I know it's near the end of the talk, but let's go for this. Let's go for two big theological words as we come towards the end. The theological words we're going to go for are transcendent and imminent. That's immanent rather than imminent, which is something about to happen. I'll define it in a second. Transcendent. God is transcendent. That is, he's above. He is higher than us. We are creatures. He is our creator. And so sometimes I think we think our decisions, our taking responsibility for our actions, it's almost like, well, I've got 10% of the responsibility and God's taking 90% because he's more powerful. Or we kind of manage it 50-50. You know, I'm sort of responsible and God's sort of responsible. But no, God is transcendent. He is creator. His kind of actions and his responsibility is on an entirely different plane, an entirely different level to ours. He's at 100% of control. He is in charge. And then we too are at 100% of control. We are in charge of our own lives under his control. Two different levels, because he is creator and we are creature. He is transcendent. I realize I have just said in about a minute something that people spend their lifetimes trying to get their heads around, so it doesn't answer all the questions. But the thing with the Bible is it just doesn't think there's an issue here. It says God's in control and we're responsible. It just says both and then gets on with it. It doesn't try and explain it. God is transcendent. He's above. But God is also immanent. That is, he's close. He is in our lives. He is involved in the day-to-day. And he is working out his huge global, transcendent, if you like, plans in the day-to-day. And that gives our lives, our decisions, our actions, huge significance. Imagine a giant oil painting, one of those that takes over an entire wall. And it's a detailed landscape with all sorts of different people in it doing the kind of things that people do in these landscape paintings, ploughing a field, riding a horse with a cart, playing a little game as a kid in the corner, and you look closer, you come right up to this giant landscape painting, and you can see every single character is painted with the most intricate brush strokes. You can tell the color of the eyes of the little child playing outside the thatched cottage in the far right corner of the picture. Great value in every single individual decision. God is working through us, just as he is working through Esther. So Esther, do something. Get involved. You can be part of God's eternal purposes, working his purposes out here, preserving and keeping his people, saving them from destruction. Don't just sit back, Esther. You can go. And so she does. And so should we. We have the privilege of stepping into God's story. Where are we tempted to sit back and just let God get on with it? Oh, he said, he'll bring his people in. It's all fine. We can just relax. To an extent, we can just relax. Jesus says, come to me and I'll give you rest. But then he says, take my burden on you, which is light and easy, but he still calls us. Not just to sit back and do nothing, but to take part in what he's doing. And it is a privilege to do so. So where are we tempted to sit back? I think sometimes, for me, sometimes it'll be, bringing up my kids. Just thinking, it's all right. They grow up. They just, they learn stuff through osmosis. I don't need to proactively teach them certain things. I think I probably should. Or building up the church. Oh, that's something somebody else can do. Like we're called to go and make disciples. Oh, yeah, the elders can do that. The home group leaders can do that. No, God calls us to get involved. Or encouraging those who are going through a hard time, those who are stuck in their houses, those who just life is really hard at the moment. Just recently, to give an illustration, Kat and I had a really rough week, and someone brought us a meal. They could have prayed for God to look after us and just, let him get on with what he says he'll do for his people. But no, they thought, right, we're going to answer that prayer ourselves. We'll bring them a meal. We can get involved in what God is doing, and it is a privilege to do so. But you might think, well, what difference can I make, though? Really? Well, remember who is writing the story. It's not us. We don't know how God will use us through even the little things. The American pastor Ray Ortlund says that each one of us is a missionary to future generations that we will never meet. We just don't know what our small act of service will do. But God does. So join in. But then finally, as we look forward to next week, the edict still stands. Yes, Mordecai has been saved, but yet the laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be revoked, and the Jews are due to be annihilated. We'll find out what happens next week. But right now, we're still in the middle of the story, and we can have confidence in the middle of our story, because just imagine Esther and Mordecai at the end of chapter 7. Yes, still anxious, but because the edict's still in place, but how encouraged must they have felt by the defeat of Haman, the elevation of Mordecai? The great reversal has started. It can only be a matter of time before God finishes it. And the fact is that is the same for us. The great reversal was started 2,000 years ago when Jesus Christ rose from the dead, defeating death forever. And this week in the church calendar was Ascension Day on Thursday. Probably passed you by. But on Ascension Day, the church traditionally has celebrated Jesus rising to heaven, forever seated high, elevated over every power and authority. The great reversal has started, and so for us, even as our lives fall apart, even as we lose those that we love, even where Christian brothers and sisters are persecuted, we can take heart, because the sovereign Lord of the universe is not just a father who cares for us. The Father has a Son who died, rose, and ascended, and sent his Spirit as a guarantee that one day we will be with him in a world made new. So finally, as we finish, what might we say to Haman? before it was too late. Haman, you spend your life with little plans to make yourself bigger. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Before we think of others, does that sound familiar in our lives? Putting ourselves forward. But Haman, you're not the king of the world. Give up your little plans. Join in with his big plans that are as big as the whole universe. If you're not a Christian here this morning, will you join in with what God is doing? He has a plan that is so detailed that it includes even our lives, but it's so big that it includes the destiny of the whole world. Will you turn aside from running your own life and entrust yourself to the loving Father who cares even for the weakest and the smallest? And here's the amazing news. We naturally want to raise ourselves up, but Jesus Christ lowered himself down, making himself nothing for us, that actually he might raise us up with him. Let me pray. Loving Father, thank you so much that our lives are in your hands. Thank you so much that you, in the person of your Son, humbled yourself in order to raise us up. Please would we humble ourselves, give up our own little plans, and join in with your big plan, what you are doing in this world today. Amen. We're going to finish by singing a song based on the ancient creed, the Nicene Creed. The song contains the line, Jesus forever seated high, Jesus the ascended King of the universe. Brothers and sisters, the great reversal has started. God is bringing about a perfect new world. Let's praise him.